Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Economic Rockstar podcast. This week I've decided to rebroadcast a previous episode, episode 73, with Robin Hanson of George Mason University. Things have been quite hectic for me the last week with the start of the new semester in the college in which I lecture, with new modules and notes to prepare, but I got quite sidetracked in preparing all of this work. And maybe sidetracked is the wrong word, as this is where my main salary comes from, so I have to give that my 100% when it's needed. So what I decided to do was rebroadcast a previous episode. I had a number of episodes in mind, and even though Robin has featured 3 times already on Economic Rockstar, I decided to go with him again only because I listened to a recent episode of Joe Rogan interviewing Elon Musk. And in part of that, they had conversations on artificial intelligence, how we could end up being less intelligent than robots of the future, whether it's on software or hardware. Elon also mentioned if technology grew by 1% every year in terms of its improvements, then imagine what we would be like as a species on planet Earth, or if we colonized other planets such as Mars and even beyond as Pluto, as he had suggested that could be a possibility, or even moons on Jupiter. Then imagine what Earth would be like, or what our capabilities would be with all of that artificial intelligence. And that reminded me of that interview I had with Robin on his book, The Age of M. Again, The Age of M, I hadn't a clue what that was until I was first exposed to Robin's work. And he explained what the Age of M was. It's the age of brain emulations, in which you can upload your intelligence, your mind, your consciousness onto software, which could also be integrated into hardware. And Elon had suggested on the Joe Rogan Experience that we could upload our mind onto software, which can pretty much be everlasting. So Robin, in this interview that I had with him, this was back in February 2016. So 2.5 years ago, in episode 73, where he talked about how we could propel ourselves forward in terms of our economy and our wealth, and that we could come to a point whereby, and I think he mentioned the word singularity again, something that Elon Musk had mentioned on the Joe Rogan Experience, that we could come to a point where technological advances, maybe through artificial intelligence, technological advances could be so exponential that at a blink of an eye, we could be catapulted to a type of society or a world or an economy that is unrecognizable and very hard to initially adapt to. And again, I know you mentioned the word artificial intelligence there, that as far as I can recall, I did ask Robin, is artificial intelligence part of Age of M? And I think he may have said no. So if you've already listened to this episode, it might be a nice way to listen to it again. Or if you haven't listened to Joe Rogan's Experience, why not pop over to that podcast and have a listen to his interview with Elon Musk. And if you're interested in Robin's work, I also had interviewed him in episode 91 and most recently in episode 122. And I know Robin has been somewhat controversial in terms of his recent research, or people have picked up on it and made it somewhat controversial. But I have to hand it to Robin. I took a break from podcasting during 2017. And it was only when Robin reached out to me asking could he come on the show to talk about his new book that I decided, almost reluctantly, to talk to him, interview him, have a conversation with him, catch up with him again. And that got things rolling for me again. So I've put out weekly episodes all through 2018, and I'd like to thank Robin for reaching out to me and getting in touch back in the late 2017, and for getting this podcast back on the road again. So thanks for listening. Check out economicrockstar.com/Robin Hanson. If you're a fan, check out his work on overcoming bias. And if you're a fan of the podcast, check out patreon.com/economicrockstar. And you can help support the show for as little as $1 a month. That's like 3 copies a year. If you prefer to support the show another way, subscribe, rate and review on iTunes. Or if you want to connect in other ways, why not check out Economic Rockstar on Facebook, on Twitter, or Instagram. Thanks for listening. All the best, and I'll talk to you next week.
Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Robin Hanson, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. We talk about the economy of the future, where brain emulations will result in economic growth doubling every month or even every week, what the future world economy will be like, and how we as humans will live with robots that can think, feel and touch, and can complete tasks 1,000 times faster than we can. Robin explains what brain emulations are and how important and vital they will become in our future economy, as well as his own plans to cryogenetically freeze his own head so that he can be reawoken in some future date, so that he can experience a possible age of M. And this topic on brain emulations is the topic of his new book, The Age of M, Work, Love and Life When Robots Rule the Earth. Check out the show notes page on economicrockstar.com/Robin Hanson. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. If you'd like to support the show and become a patron of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, please visit patreon.com, Patreon, and in the search bar, type in Economic Rockstar to find out more.
So these emulations, yes, of course, they take over the world, but in the same way that industrialists took over the world from farmers, or farmers took over the world from foragers, a new way of life appears, and it's more efficient and more productive.
Will your whole body be frozen, or will it be just your brain?
It's a head only.
Head only
phrasing, right? That's my contract. Yes. And of course, that is in part because I think brain emulation is the most likely way to be revived.
Never miss an episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast. Visit economicrockstar.com, submit your name and email, and you will get each episode straight to your inbox. Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar Podcast. I am so honoured to have Professor Robin Hanson join me today. Hi, Robin. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Robin Hanson is Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He is also Research Associate at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute and Chief Scientist at Consensus Point. Professor Hanson has diverse research interests, including spatial product competition, health incentive contracts, reversible computation, the origin of life, the survival of humanity, very long-term economic growth, growth-given machine intelligence, and interstellar colonization, to name but a few, I think. Robin has pioneered prediction markets, also known as information markets and idea futures, since 1988. He has a passion to understand everything and to save the world. He is addicted to few quakes, loves to argue one-on-one, and values honesty and passion. He blogs at overcomingbias.com, which has had over 8 million visits. His book, which we'll be discussing today, The Age of M, Work, Love and Life When Robots Rule the Earth, will be available in May 2016. And also The Elephant in the Brain, co-authored with Kevin Simler in spring 2017. Robin, you have quite a diverse portfolio of interests. And delving a little deeper into your bio, I realized that you have an interest in physics, as well as economics, and much, much more. Where did this all culminate? Was this something that you had interest in when you were a child growing up?
Actually, I think most humans who lean in the direction of being intellectuals are naturally pretty broad. But in order to succeed in academia, you have to force yourself to focus. And many people fail to become successful academics, even if they're smart intellectuals, because they don't focus enough. So I am sort of squeaking by on the edge of not having failed, even though I'm more broad than academia rewards in once.
Your book, The Age of M, I'm quite overwhelmed by reading it, and I haven't gone through it all yet, all 430 pages, but quite a fascinating insight into the future. And you mentioned that we are on the cusp of a singularity. that could catapult our economic growth in terms of the technologies and what are known as brain emulations, or what you call M's. Could you describe what an M is, or even firstly what a singularity is?
Well, singularity might be a grandiose term that has too many different associations, but the way I'm using the term is a relatively sudden, very large increase in the growth rate of the world economy. So in a sense, we've seen at least 3 of those so far, with the introduction of humans, the introduction of farming, and the introduction of industry. Each of them, the world economy grew by at least 50 and often over, and maybe over 100 times faster within the space of a previous doubling time. So that's close enough to a dramatic event. I'll call it a singularity. And so there might be another one, and if it followed the statistics of the previous ones, it would occur within a few-year period, and within that period, the world economy would go from doubling every 15 years, like it does now, to doubling every month or even faster. So whatever you want to call that, that would be a big, important, dramatic event. And so the age of M is about what happens after one such possible event, the sort of thing that could cause a huge change like that.
Would that be quite a welcome occurrence if you had growth that doubled every week or every day almost? Or could you envision something quite catastrophic that could stem from that?
So by ordinary economist standards, faster growth is good. So if you ask most any economist, would it be good to grow faster, they would probably give you a thumbs up. So I've written a book which is about a particular scenario, a particular technology, and all its consequences, one of which is faster growth. And one of my working principles has been to not try to evaluate it very much at first, to mainly focus on saying what is or what would be, given my assumptions, and to set the table, to set the context for other people to evaluate it if they like. But honestly, I think people in futurism are way too fast to evaluate things. They get a few vague hints about how some future scenario might be different, and they are all over it in terms of saying it's good or bad. And I think you should see a world in great detail and know a lot about it before you make this judgment about whether it's good or bad. So I have tried not to say very much about whether it's good or bad, but to focus on just saying what it's like.
Would you describe yourself as a futurist?
Well, I couldn't not, having written this book, I guess. I mean, depends on how you define it. Sure, I'll say it's a book about the future, so I guess that makes me a futurist.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are people who find it very difficult to know how you can, or somebody can envision how the future would be. I'm sure there have been people in the past who have envisioned a certain future that actually has been realized, given the technological advances we've had since the 1950s, say.
So I list in the book some successful futurists, in the sense that some people who actually thought carefully and seemed to be making reasonable analyses. But of course, that's in the context of lots more futurists who are not very careful or sloppy. I mean, arguably, most of the customers for futurists don't care very much how careful they are and how accurate they are. They're looking more for inspiring visions, either things to hope for or things to fear. And that's seems to be the market for futurism, and I'm not selling to that market. But other people in the past have also just tried to be level-headed and analyze things, and a number of them have done pretty well. And so I've written this book in part to show that you can analyze the future. So, basically we have a lot more study of the past at the moment than we do of the future. Even though the future matters more, if you ask people why, they say, well, because we can't study the future. But we can study the past, and I'm saying you can study the future. And my method is just very simple. I just take standard results in different academic fields and just apply them. Low-hanging fruit, most conventional, most well-accepted results, and just apply them.
Is this a matter of extrapolating the data in a certain way to try and predict certain outcomes?
Well, implicitly, but it's more just taking our standard best theories and applying them when we know what they are. And so, of course, those standard best theories are based on past data, and that's where they come from. But we don't have to look directly at data. So some people do futurism by trend extrapolation. They say, well, look, computers are getting cheaper, therefore, look, leisure time is going up, therefore, marriage rates are going down, therefore, they project into the future what a world looks like if those trends continue. That's not what I'm doing at all. I'm not projecting trends. I am taking a very particular scenario that I guess we should lay out for our listeners what that is, and then I'm asking, what do our standard theories imply about it? Our standard physics theories, engineering, sociology, economics, etc., in business, and just say, what do these theories say about a scenario like this, and filling a book full of that.
And what is the scenario then with brain emulations?
All right. So it's a subset of the robot scenario. So you may have heard talk over the last few years about how robots are getting better, and if they get really good, they might change a lot. And this is a particular kind of a robot scenario. So the usual way we've been making robots over the last 70 years or so is we just write better software and we, hook it up to better hardware. And so we look at something people are doing. I used to do this professionally for 9 years while I was an AI researcher. And you look at what people are doing. You try to make a hypothesis about how they do it. You write software based on that hypothesis and you implement it, and then you see how well it can do. And that's what we've been doing for a while. We've been slowly getting better at it, but honestly, it's slow. When I ask people how far we've come in the last 20 years, who are AI researchers in the field they know best, they say 5 to 10% of the way.
Okay.
And so that suggests 2 to 4 centuries. It's a long time. So I'm talking about a different approach, a different way to make smart robots, which is instead of writing software that does what you want, you port the software. You take it from somewhere else where the software already exists, but you move it to a new machine. And that's the brain emulation approach. The idea is to take actual individual human brains like yours and mine, scan them in very fine spatial and chemical detail to see which cells are where and what chemical densities they have, then to create computer models of how each cell works in terms of taking input signals and changing internal state and output signals, make a bunch of models for every cell you found in a scan, put that all together in one big model in a computer, and run it. So if you've got big enough computers and good enough models and a good enough scan, then the input-output behavior of this computer model should be usefully close to the input-output behavior of the original brain, i.e. you could do it, talk back, maybe ask it to do things, and it might do them. That is a brain emulation. And so now, if this computer that runs this brain emulation costs $1 billion, it's a research curiosity, but not much more. If it costs $1 million or $1,000, it changes the world.
Which means at such a low price that we could have, or we can be able to have certain brain emulations,
right,
as part of our domestic life.
No, so, most of world income goes to workers because that's where most of the wealth is in the ability of human minds to work. So when you have substitutes, direct substitutes for human minds on computers, then they can get most of world income, and they would. So employers would choose to hire the M's to replace the human workers en masse across pretty much all jobs.
So that's where the economics comes in then, isn't it?
Overwhelmingly, yes.
Yeah.
Huge. So,
and there's a lot to explain. You mentioned in your book efficiencies and so on, but I suppose what people are talking about right now is the possibility of robots, which are replacing human workers. And that's what some people would see as to being a worrying or a fascinating event that will occur because it increases our leisure time.
So over the last few centuries, we've been replacing people with machines relatively steadily and consistently, and we've been doing it at a slow enough rate that when people lose their jobs, there's enough time to be warned about that and then find other jobs. So overall, the economy continues to do better because so far there have been plenty of jobs for people to still do. And like I said, at recent rates of progress, that'll probably continue to be true for another 2 to 4 centuries. We could just keep going and replacing jobs. But eventually, when computers are better at all of the jobs compared to people, then it's a different world. Basically, humans have to retire en masse. So we've seen what retirement looks like for individuals before, so it's not a strange, unfamiliar thing. When people get old enough that they're no longer productive or don't want to work anymore, and they have enough money to retire, then they stop working and they live off their investments. So at some point when computers can do pretty much everything better than humans, humanity en masse must retire. Now, we would collectively own pretty much everything in this new world. And this new world would be very wealthy and growing wealthier very fast. So collectively, we would all have plenty to live on and have a comfortable retirement, but we may not share so that all of us are comfortable. That's a different question.
With a brain emulation, I'm finding it very difficult to visualize because obviously when we see or think of a robot or a machine, we might see a physical representation of a human being. Could this be possibly the case, or could it take in any form? Because at the end of the day, all it is data that can be transferred or transported from one A to B.
So imagine that you are a person and you know that you're about to undergo this brain scan. And after this brain scan, there will be you as you are now, and then there will also be this brain emulation. And that's a strange concept, but okay. And then, afterwards, we say, hey, you there, welcome. You are the emulation. And you say, well, I don't feel any different. And you look around perhaps, and, you're in a similar building to what you were in before, et cetera. And now we could make the world very strange for you. We could just make everything's weird and awkward. But you probably wouldn't like that. It probably wouldn't be very conducive to getting you to work for us and be useful for us. So we'll probably make this world be as comfortable and familiar as we can to you. So we will give you an environment that looks familiar. Maybe we'll even give you an artificial body that looks a lot like yours. So you can look down and see your hands and look at yourself in the mirror. We'll give you whatever it takes to make you comfortable and useful, because just putting you in a strange, awkward world doesn't probably going to help very much. But now that you're an emulation, we'll have to convince you that you are one and explain your new situation. But then you try out your body, you'll try out your mind, and you'll see that there's some new options. And once you get used to it and you aren't scared to death, and now the world changes because, of course, you might not be willing to do things. But hey, if you aren't, somebody else might. We'll try a few thousand people. We'll get some of them willing to do things. And now those people, we can make many copies. So, we will ask you, would you like to make a copy? This will be the copy will do this other job over here. You've been doing this job over okay. You seem to be okay with it. This other guy will have a similar job and a similar salary. Is that okay with you? And if you say yes, then there'll be another version of you. Wow. And then you can go talk to the first one if you want, or you can ignore him and continue with your new life. And, again, it can be weird, or it cannot be weird. And you might just freak out and say, no, I don't want anything like this. Turn me off. And fine, you get turned off. But the prediction is that somebody, and many individual humans, will find this okay as emulations. They will like their life as an emulation, accept it and live in it. And it just takes a few hundred of us in the entire world to do that, to fill up a world full of these brain emulations and to make all the economic changes I'm predicting. So I'm not predicting that very many of us are okay with this and do it. I'm just predicting a few hundred of us do, and that's enough.
I can almost see, and it's very hard to visualize something like this without having to resort to sci-fi movies or books, where you might look at the possibilities of a few hundred people that have brain emulations and clone those or repeat those over and over, dominating or taking over the world, being able to control them. Would they have synchronous thoughts or synchronous behaviors, or would they be somewhat independent once they've had the brain emulation and they can behave and act in any way they desire if it fits into the particular mold that they've been emulated for, in terms of whether it's working at a factory or working for intelligence agencies or something like that? Could there be, not doomsday scenario, I don't want to be negative about it, because this is a very positive thing. It can be a very positive thing also. But how do we escape from that particular mindset regarding that sci-fi catastrophic doomsday scenario?
Well, first of all, most science fiction which has any elements of this is trying to play up the drama of it. So it tries to, find the most extreme situations that would make you feel the most queasy or weird and most anxious about, because that makes good drama. But in fact, when technology appears and we adapt to it, we usually try to find a way to make it seem ordinary and to seem as a continuation from the past. So even if, you could imagine a science fiction movie written 40 years ago about people walking around staring at their screens all the time, walking down the street, and you can imagine they would have made that movie as to make it weird and eerie, and these minds have been taken over by these machines, right? Because that would play up the drama of it. But of course, we're living in this world and we walk down the street and stare at our screens, but it doesn't feel strange and weary to us. We've gotten used to it. We see it as a continuation from the past rather than as something strange. And of course, that's what will happen in the future too. Even if to us, if we had it described all at once, it would definitely seem very strange and maybe even eerie and repulsive. All the social forces available are trying to find a way to make you see it as ordinary and acceptable and a continuation of the past. So that's what you should expect to see for pretty much any future that shows up, is that mostly if there's a products that people choose to use and they're available, then people will find a way to see it as ordinary and fine. So brain emulations are like that. Obviously, since we don't live in this world, and I'm writing a book all of a sudden introducing you to this strange world, it's going to seem strange to you, and it might even seem frightening to you, perhaps. But surely you have to know that they don't see it that way any more than we are frightened very much by our world. I mean, there are some points of view you can look at yourself. Oh my God, we're staring at our screens all the day. What have we become? But we don't usually think that way, right? That's a pretty unusual frame of mind to be in. Mostly we're okay with what we're doing because it seems to work out okay. So these emulations, yes, of course, they take over the world. But in the same way that industrialists took over the world from farmers, or farmers took over the world from foragers, a new way of life appears, and it's more efficient and more productive. And then eventually the old way of life, there's only a very few people on the margin who still use. So even today, there's a limited number of subsistence farmers out there. There's even few foragers, and most of us have accepted the industrial way of life. Well, now in the future, there'll be this new way of life, and most of the world will move into that new way. Most firms, most nations, most organizations will adopt it pretty overwhelmingly, and that'll just be the usual way of doing things. And there might be a few holdouts who refuse to get involved, who live off on the margins on their retirement savings, and people will think that's kind of an interesting curiosity, but they wouldn't pay much attention to it.
So we are witnessing, I suppose, the beginning of the fourth revolution, because we had, as you mentioned there, the Industrial Revolution replacing muscle with machine, and now we have the beginnings of our intelligence being replaced or enhanced by these external devices or brain emulations. As a kid growing up, you've probably seen this movie yourself with Johnny Five, the robot, who was a part of some corporation and an experiment, and he became humanized almost with feelings and emotions, and he quickly read books and watched TV programs, and it was an example of what we know today, what's called machine learning. And these algorithms, and there's companies out there now at the moment that are producing algorithms and I think you mentioned, you in a way referred to it at the beginning, whereby our growth in terms of our knowledge is only 5%, and to continue on with enhancing our understanding or increasing our knowledge is going to take centuries, whereas with machine learning and developing algorithms, it's going to be a lot quicker. And being able to have breakthroughs based on the knowledge that these machines will actually be able to develop is only going to be great, I'm sure, for humanity.
Well, let me disagree a little bit there.
Yeah.
So enormous number of things have happened in the last 2 million years. An awful lot of interesting things. Nevertheless, only 3 enormous things have happened. Again, humans, farming, and industry. For example, the introduction of writing was not one of those 3 things. It was important and it made a lot of difference, but it didn't actually change the fundamental growth rate of the economy. It was part of the growth of the economy. That is, if the economy doubles, then a lot of things have to change in order to support the economy doubling. And so at some point, writing was one of those things. But the vast majority of things that happen that are interesting and useful do not change the growth rate of the economy. And so they are not one of these 3 or 4 huge, enormous things. So I would say so far, and even in the foreseeable future, machine learning is not one of those 4 things. Machine learning is useful, and we will be using it and continue to use it to do many things, but it's not at the moment changing the growth rate of the economy, and it's not in the foreseeable future going to do that. Emulations have the potential to actually change the growth rate of the economy, and it could be that after emulation someday, perhaps machine learning or some other form of software-based artificial intelligence, it will also create yet another era that changes the growth rate of the economy. But I don't at the moment see a current use of machine learning as something other than part of the continuing growth of the economy that continues to allow our economy to double every 15 years, but not changing the growth rate. Emulations, though, are the thing I see as next changing the growth rate, and a lot. Doubling every 15 years to doubling every month or faster.
I just had that vision whereby the brain emulation, it is a computerized device or software, but this software could integrate the machine learning capabilities, no?
Well,
and enhance and be more creative.
Today, humans write machine learning programs.
Yes.
And when there are emulations, the emulations can write machine learning programs. Okay. But a key idea is that an emulation is kind of a black box, at least initially. Brains are enormously complicated things, and when we can make an emulation of it, we don't know how they work. That is, the idea is we don't understand the organization of the brain or how to redesign it. So it's the same way of taking a piece of software that's spaghetti code and a mess and nevertheless porting it to a new machine and turning it on and running it, but without understanding how it was written or how to improve it. So early on, there are these emulations, and you can select among humans for the better ones, and you can maybe run them faster or slower, and you can make copies, but that's pretty much it. You can't take the music out of this guy and mix it with the sports of the other guy and the third guy's sense of humor and make a new thing that combines those things. You can't do that. You just take one guy and you turn him on and you run him faster or slower and you make copies. That's it.
Okay. It sounds quite okay then, isn't it? In terms of your brain emulation could be a handheld device. A ring on your finger.
If you want to pay for that.
Yeah.
If you want. I mean, they could fit into all sorts of machines, but of course you will have to pay for them, but they'll be cheap. So you as a marginal human living off your retirement savings, being ridiculously rich compared to most of the emulations, yes, you can spend your wealth on all sorts of arbitrary uses for emulations, just in the same way that a, ancient emperor could have slaves to be his statuary and to make a cartwheel and to make a boat out of people, and he could just do all sorts of things because he was so rich and had so many slaves. He could do all sorts of things with them. So sure, a few people could do that, but I'm focused on the center of the economy where these emulations live and what their lives are like. It's much harder to predict what random things the idle rich will do than what the competitive working class will do. The workers have to do whatever it takes to survive, and it's easier to predict that.
So when it comes to cities, and you mentioned this in your book as well, you believe that there might be about 4 large cities and where all these brain emulations will congregate and do the majority of the work. Will humans live in these cities too, or? No. Okay. Where we live on another planet, or can we send these brain emulations to other planets?
So first of all, humans get a lot of value by congregating together in cities. But that value is limited because congestion limits city sizes. So as we make cities bigger, more and more time is spent traveling across them, which is expensive and time consuming, and that limits just how big we can make cities today. Emulations can much more easily travel across their cities because they can do it virtually, and that allows their cities to be much larger. So that allows them to concentrate it just in a few huge cities rather than spread across thousands of cities like we do. And so if they're concentrated in a few very huge cities, that doesn't take much space. So in essence, most of the earth is away from these cities. And so humans can pretty much live like they do now, using up most of the rest of the earth because the emulations don't want it. Emulations want to be near each other in these very few, very dense cities, and that they are very eager to be there, and there's huge money to be made by being there, and that's where they're most productive, and so that's where they are. Just like we tend to congregate in cities too, even though, there's a huge earth out there, but most people are not spread out across the oceans or spread out across the mountains and et cetera. They're concentrated in a small number of dense cities, and emulations even more so.
Will the wages of these brain emulations filter through the owner, the original owner, or whoever controls these few emulations? And then they live on a subsistence?
So we've actually seen subsistence level economies in the past. In fact, the vast majority, pretty much all animals who have ever lived have lived at subsistence level economy, and pretty much all humans until a few hundred years ago lived in a subsistence level economy. So it's not a strange thing. We know what it looks like. And in a subsistence economy, the workers earn barely enough money in order to survive. And people who own other things, capital, land, patents, stock, whatever, those people can earn additional money off of their other investments. And so that's what it would be like in the emulation economy too. The emulations would mostly make barely enough to survive, but there would be other capital that one could own in a capitalist emulation economy. You could own, again, real estate, you could own patents, you could own stock, you could own a government that taxes the rest of them, and whoever owns those things, they can get additional income, and therefore they can live at above subsistence level using that income. And it might be a small number who are very rich, or larger numbers who are not so rich. But basically, that's where the money goes, is whoever owns those things, and that's how it works in pretty much any subsistence economy. People are very interested often in the question of whether the emulations would be slaves. But it turns out that in a subsistence economy, it doesn't really that much matter whether they're slaves from the point of view of where the money goes. When workers can barely earn enough to eat, then if you own a slave and you have to pay him to eat, you don't actually get very much extra out of owning the slave other than just hiring him at the subsistence wage. So in the past, when owning slaves was valuable, was when wages were well above subsistence level. That's when owning a slave was worth something, because again, you get the difference between how productive they are and how much you have to pay to feed them. When that difference goes away, then there's not much point in owning one. And that's the kind of world we're talking about, where that difference goes away.
I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now. Robin, I'd love to know where you got your initial thoughts from. I know in your blog you wanted to write about something you mentioned to your readers, and you had certain ideas floating around, and then you put out a 62,000 word pre-book and looked for some criticisms and advice and feedback, and positive or negative, and hence the age of M happened to come from this. But deep-rooted, where is it all coming from in terms of your knowledge and your quest for idea generation and so on?
So we can think about this in two steps. Long ago, I was a computer researcher in Silicon Valley, and I developed a hobby of studying institutions and social science, and I wanted to make that hobby into a career. I was spending a lot of time hanging out with futurists and science fiction people, and as I learned more social science, I became frustrated that most futurists and science fiction folks don't really know much social science. So they know some physics or engineering or biology even, and they use their knowledge of that to foresee technologies that are coming. If they're futurists, they talk about what that technology will have as an impact, but they're doing this mostly as social amateurs. That is, they're using the amateur intuitions most ordinary people have about how societies work, which are not as good as professionals, not by a long shot. And so I was always frustrated that there was relatively little use of professional social science, professional understanding about how societies work in order to predict the implications of these technologies. So when I was a grad student starting out in economics, my first Christmas vacation after my first semester of classes, I decided to sit down and use my basic principles of economics to sketch out the basics of an emulation world. And I wrote a paper back then called If Uploads Come First. And that was just the basic sketch of it, and that seemed to me a promising sort of thing you could do for many futurist scenarios, is just to use very simple economics about it. But then, of course, I needed to do the work that would be published and accepted by the academic community, and so that's what I focused on. But in the background, I just wished somebody would do more with that sort of thing, but there really wasn't much interest for a long time. And so now, over 20 years later, I decided, well, I picked that as my project to work on, is to say, let's just do that. It's a straightforward thing. It's not very clever. It's not very sophisticated. It just says take the standard things we know and apply them to these scenarios and just turn the crank and just find out what happens. So now there's a separate question of how I choose that project among the other projects I considered at the time more recently to work on. So when I got tenure as an academic, I enjoyed the freedom of tenure like many people do, which meant I started writing a blog, and that meant I could just every week I could read about a new topic and get interested in it and write something up and then go on to another topic. And I realized that wasn't going to give me much of an intellectual legacy. If I wanted to have a legacy and have something that lasted, I needed to focus. But my problem was, in a sense, I had all these children, all these beloved intellectual children that I was interested in and wanted to pursue. And what I needed to do was starve most of them so I could focus on one or two of them. So how could I neglect all my other children was the question. And the obvious answer is, in a sense, to find the child who's most endearing and engrossing and would most suck me into paying attention to it and neglecting all the rest. So I chose this topic as one that just had all this fascinating detail that would suck me in, and that where there wasn't anybody else in my way. I didn't need funding. I didn't need data. I didn't need, permission from organizations or something to do it. I could just jump in and do it, and had all this fascinating data, so it would pull me in. And of course, in retrospect, I wasn't even thinking about it, but this is well suited for someone like me who has done an unacceptably or unusual wide variety of intellectual subjects. Again, academia doesn't reward that much. Academia wants you to be the world expert in only one thing, and they don't care much about other things. But if you do happen to be someone who's learned many fields, one of the ways to get people to pay attention to that fact or to use it is to do a project that actually requires many fields. And this is such a project. As I basically said, here's an entire world. Describe as much of this world as you can. And so that means you need to understand our best theories in a wide variety of areas in order to apply them to this world and ask, what is this world like in those areas?
And what one theory in economics, or a few theories in economics, that at the time when you wrote that paper, what stood out to you? Because I know you made reference to a Malthusian catastrophe in your book.
Well, definitely even back in 1994, that one of the obvious implications that's been robust since then is the idea that wages fall to subsistence levels. And again, that's not a strange, unusual scenario. You can call it a catastrophe, but it's the standard way most humans have ever lived. And it's the standard way pretty much all animals have ever lived. It's the usual case. And we're going to go back to the usual case, and calling it a catastrophe is just putting your head in the sand, I think, about refusing to acknowledge that it can be the sort of thing that happens.
Because if I could retire at the age of, say, 22, if I owned some M's, I'd be quite a happy person, even if I'm living on a margin, but still enjoying my life. Would you be the same as well yourself? Or?
Well, again, in this world, humans own most everything, at least initially. And so if the world grows rapidly in wealth, they're the ones who are getting that wealth, so they can rapidly get more and more comfortable in their retirement. So for the humans who have an average level of wealth, their life is very good, at least as long as they don't want to run things and be in the center of activities. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is true for ordinary people when they retire. When you retire, you don't have to work anymore, and you can, sleep in late, and you can socialize a lot. But what you might miss, which many retired people do miss, is not being in the center of action, not being controlled, not being the one who decides and determines what happens. And so humans will have to accept that fate. They can live comfortably in leisure and enjoy themselves and socialize, but they can't be where the action is, and they aren't deciding the big decisions, and they aren't making the big things happen. They are on the margins watching.
If you were living in the age of M right now, I might not be talking to you, I might be talking to a brain emulation of you, but what would you be doing right now, and what would your brain emulations be doing for you? Would it be cranking out academic papers one every 30 seconds? Right. And
so the typical speed that I estimate for emulations in this world is roughly 1,000 times human speed. So they are typically running much faster than we do. And so from their point of view, their world is more stable than ours. So our world doubles many times in a lifetime, in our useful work lifetime. So if we have a 60-year work lifetime, then the world economy doubles 4 times in 60 years, which is a lot. For emulations, the world economy will double roughly once in their work lifetime. And so it's a stable world, even though it's a faster world objectively, and certainly fast relative to humans, it's slower relative to them. So the typical emulation is doing whatever the jobs are that need doing. So in a subsistence level economy, they are doing mostly the jobs that support subsistence. So they are making computers, they are repairing them, they are building structures to hold them, they are putting energy support supplies into them, they are pulling things out and cooling, they are managing communication networks, they are doing, of course, innovation to improve all these things, defense against attack for all these things, the straightforward things. Just like 1,000 years ago, a subsistence farmer's life was relatively straightforward and easy to predict. What were subsistence farmers doing? Well, they were making the things they needed to survive: food, clothing, shelter, heat, the sort of things they needed to survive was pretty much most of what they did. And you can say the same about an emulation economy. Most of what they're doing are the things they need to survive, which are relatively easy to predict. So if I were a successful M worker in this world, I would have to be doing one of those things. I would have to find myself a niche where I was useful at doing one of the standard things that needed doing. That could be writing software. It could be, doing pipe maintenance. Could be all sorts of things. Now, there would still be a few specialized artists or academics or things like that. There always have been a few people like that. They just were a smaller percentage of the world thousands of years ago, and they'll probably be stay a smaller percentage in the future.
Is it possible for a brain emulation to evolve from, say, DNA sample? Or would it have to be a scan of a brain?
So there's 2 kinds of answers to give. So one important thing is to say is I'm not talking about the entire future. So in the entire future, a great many things will eventually happen. I'm talking about the next era after ours, and this next era may only last 2 years in objective clock time, after which something else will happen. And I don't know what the next thing will happen. I could ask me to speculate, but basically I focused on this next era and saying what happens then. And so during this next era, its beginning is defined by when you can at least first make an emulation. And when you can first make it, it's when you make it in the easiest possible way. Later on, it may be possible to make them in all sorts of other ways, but probably by then other stuff's going on and all the world's changed in other ways. So, will we eventually colonize a galaxy? Sure, but not in the M era. Okay. Will we make fusion energy? Maybe, but maybe not in the M era. So there's all sorts of things that will likely happen eventually in the future that don't necessarily happen during this M era. This is just, by definition, in a sense, it's around the scenario that the next really big thing that happens that really dramatically changes the growth rate of the economy is the arrival of brain emulations. And then for a while, that drives most change. And then eventually something else drives change, and I don't know what that is. And eventually all the other things we've ever heard about will happen too. Genetic engineering, space travel, fusion energy, whatever it is you imagine, probably eventually it's going to happen, but not necessarily in the next era.
And it's because the age of brain emulation will catapult us through that 2-year period where we make so many advancements, whether it's to do with scientific discoveries, to do with health, the economy, etc. They'll just catapult us through such high speed that we will end up in a fifth age of space travel or something.
If the world economy doubles every month, then in a year it grows by a factor of 1,000, and in 2 years it's a factor of 1,000,000. So at the end of this period, you should imagine a world economy that's vastly larger than ours.
Yeah.
It's vastly more powerful. It can do a lot more. Whatever it wants to do, it's the 800,000-pound gorilla that can do what it wants. But what it wants to do is survive, and so it's very driven to perpetuate itself in the subsistence economy. So most of its energies will be devoted to those basic subsistence inputs.
So you wouldn't want to blink. I've had a recent guest, and I've noticed that you acknowledge him in your book, Manu Saadia. And I had him on the podcast a while back recently, and he talks about Trekonomics. His book is on Trekonomics. I'm sure that would probably be the age after the age of M. Have you had?
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily. Have you had many fruitful discussions with Manu?
I've met him online. We haven't talked very much. But I look forward to seeing his book. I haven't seen it, so I don't know what's in it. But I do know Star Trek, of course, being a longtime science fiction fan. And so Star Trek is, a certain kind of projection that it's, dramatically inspiring, and it engages people well as fiction. It's not, I don't think, a very careful analysis of what's likely to actually happen. So, well, first of all, so there's two big things to notice. One is that we've been increasing over the last century per capita wealth. So we've been individually getting richer, and many projections of the future just assume that per capita wealth continues to increase. So then they look at, how will people change as they get richer and more self-indulgent and more lazy and less tolerant of risk or less tolerant of disruption and risk and aggression, because that has been the trend over the last century or two. And so it seems natural to project the trend forward. And of course, in the short run, that's perfectly fine. Over the next decade or two, it's just fine to project past trends over a century or two forward. But over the long run, there is no obvious reason why per capita wealth needs to increase. Per capita wealth has only increased in the last century or two because our ability to create wealth has been faster than our ability to create people. Our technology for creating people and the rate at which we can create them basically hasn't improved at all. Whereas our technology for creating wealth has been increased and improved in vast ways. But once we have a technology for creating people substitutes fast, then all of a sudden per capita wealth, the wealth per person, could drastically fall. And therefore all the projections you make based on assuming that we'll continue to get richer just don't have to follow. So one thing is to say is just beware of projections of the future that assume per person wealth increases in some sort of absolute law. It may well increase for a while, but it doesn't have to. And in my age of M scenario is a scenario where it definitely doesn't. So that was point number one. Point number two is people often assume that familiar economic growth rates just continue. So if the world economy doubles every 15 years now, then of course it will just keep doubling. Although even then, when you start to talk about traveling to other stars or something, you realize it's really hard to maintain a doubling every 15 years growth rate when it takes, 20 years just to go to the next star or something. So we'll sometimes maybe think the growth rates slow down a bit when we're off in space. But I think the way you should think about it is that if there's any way that our economy can figure out to grow faster here on Earth, then it will. Whatever parts of it grow faster, they will dominate quickly. And then as soon as we have a fast-growing economy on Earth, space suddenly looks a lot more expensive and discouraging. If it takes a year to go to Mars, and then the economy doubles by a factor of 1,000, that's an enormous opportunity cost for whatever investment you put in that thing, right? Yeah. It means you have to be ridiculously profitable in order to accept a delay that long to get whatever return on investment you're looking for. So during an era of the future where growth rates are much faster than in our era, basically either you have to figure out a way to get around space a lot faster than we do now, or you basically don't want to go there. You want to hang around close to whatever the action is. So colonizing the solar system or even colonizing other stars, those are in some sense intrinsically slow things. just physics really sets speed limits on those things. And so if our economy can find a way to grow faster, then we will just keep growing fast for a while and ignore those opportunities. And it's only when the growth rate of our economy eventually slows down again that we'd start to look out at those things as being attractive options. So the space age could be, in fact, a long way away in terms of the number of doublings of the economy. That is, our economy might increase by a factor of 1 million, billion, or even trillion before it's time to go back into space again.
Okay.
At which point, everything has changed. In which case, all the sort of context that you would use to predict what, Star Trek would be like or things like that are just completely wrong. Yeah. Once our economy is a factor of 1 trillion times larger than it is now, you really know nothing about what their taste in coffee looks like, or their haircuts, or their organization, what bosses are allowed to do to, subordinates, or just all the sorts of things that, a show like Star Trek just assumes haven't changed that much from today. It would just be all changed.
We may have morphed into something else as human beings, we just to climatize with the environment that we're living in.
Right. So, I think people often give lip service to the idea that the future could be different than today. But honestly, when they write stories or fiction, they don't go very far away from the world they know, because it starts to feel like you don't know what to say or you can't even make sense of it. So in some sense, my book is sort of stretching that. I think if you read my book, you will get a vision of how strange yet familiar a future world could actually be. Because given that I've tried to work out very carefully what actually happens, I claim all of it actually makes sense in terms of our standard theories, but I think you'll agree that collectively it's a pretty weird world, and in a sense, a lot weirder than Star Trek.
Could it be possible that, say, for example, an intelligent mind like your own, if your brain could be scanned, that you would hold the intellectual property of that brain scan, and then you could leave that in a will to pass on to somebody else, and that they could in some way integrate your intelligence into their own brain? That's probably a ridiculous idea. Or could they just hold your brain emulation and integrate it into their own brain emulation?
So again, it's about the timescales. So I assume that the easiest thing happens first.
Yeah.
And then as soon as the easiest thing happens, a lot of stuff happens before the next easiest thing is possible. So the easiest thing to imagine is you just take a brain and you scan it and you run an emulation of it, and you don't know how it works, and you don't know how to combine it with anything. So this idea of taking two emulations, even if they're computer files, and merging them together, if you take two random pieces of software on your computer and say, what would these software look like if they were merged together? I think you'll ask any software engineer and they'll say, but I don't know how to do that, right? I'd have to look into this code in great detail and understand it before I can merge these pieces of software. Sure, if you have two pieces of software on your computer, you can run them each and maybe even have them talk to each other. But to merge them into a single piece of software that has all the merged functionality, that's just vastly harder. And so the idea here for brain emulations is you have an emulation and you can run it, make copies, run it fast or slow, but you can't merge it with another one for a long time until you understand them. And so that would take a while. And so I can at least talk about the era before that's possible. And even then, I don't think the merging actually makes that much of a difference. So I have a little discussion at the end of the book about implications it might have. And honestly, I don't think it makes that much difference from the rest of the book. And it has a few minor changes, but honestly, mostly the world is pretty much the way it was even without merging.
I'd love to know your decision to be cryogenetically frozen. Is this something that you want to do in order to experience the possibility of living through an age of M?
Well, it was more just generic, wanting to not die and wanting to see whatever the future is like. Yeah. So obviously, if the future is an age of M, then that's the future I want to see. If the future is some other future, well, I want to see that too. So I don't mean to give the impression that I'm highly confident that the age of M is the next stage. My analysis is conditional on that being the next stage, and then I take that as my assumption and work it through. So I've said in the book that I think there's roughly a 10% chance at least that, scenario I've described in the book is relevant for what happens. It might be exactly like, but it could be close enough to be relevant. But honestly, if the future is important, it's worth having many books that focus on many different scenarios, right? So if it's worth having 1,000 books on the future, then it's worth having books, each of which only has a 1 in 1,000 chance of describing the actual scenario, because there's enough of us out there and the future is important enough. So I don't need I don't very much emphasize a high probability of the scenario. I'm more emphasizing that it's a high enough probability to be worth thinking about. And it's a demonstration of what you could do for all the other scenarios. I'm doing far more detail about this scenario than I think anybody's ever done for a, disruptive technology scenario.
Will your whole body be frozen, or will it be just your brain?
It's a head only.
Head only.
Phrasing. Right. That's my contract. Yes. And of course that is in part because I think brain emulation is the most likely way to be revived. So there are many
your organs.
Well, basically, I just think, the bodies are really, human bodies and biology is really a complicated thing. And in order to take a frozen brain or body and figure out how to revive it, that's going to just take a long time. That's just really complicated technology. Brain emulation seems a less complicated technology. You just have to read the right parts of the brain in the scan and then make a computer model without making all the things work again. So I think brain emulation will be possible well before the other sort of thing is possible. And so, but I want to do the first thing that's possible because honestly, every year you wait is another risk that it won't last. Honestly, I think the major risk with cryonics is that the organizations won't last.
All right. Yeah.
I think most likely the future will be rich and most likely eventually they'll have the capacity to revive people. But if the organization hasn't saved you between now and then, it doesn't work. So I think you want to be revived as soon as possible in whatever form is possible.
Yes. And then possibly be frozen again if there is a possibility there.
Well, once you're in emulation, you're just a computer file. You can just be archived, so you don't need to be frozen again. You're just, it's vastly easier to preserve emulations. So in some sense, emulations are in principle immortal. That is because they can be saved in backup and archive files computer files that can be saved redundantly and placed in many places. They are in principle immortal, but today our houses and cars are in principle immortal in the sense that if we keep repairing them, they can last forever. But that doesn't mean we do keep preparing them to last forever. In fact, houses and cars do typically die. So the fact that emulations could last forever doesn't mean they will. It's a matter of who will actually pay for that.
What other economic concepts tend to stand out for you in this book? Because we briefly mentioned about labor, indirectly mentioned about competition, and about society and the building of cities and so on. Is there anything else that is theoretically studied in economics today that could be replicated or challenged in the age of M?
Well, in a sense, the book is full of things like that. So I take as many things as I know and I try to talk about their implications in this world. I also take some subjects that economists don't usually deal with that much and take them seriously. So I have read a fair bit of sociology, and so I have a section on ritual, for example, and ask what rituals they might have, a section on identity and ask how they will see their identity, and even a section on mating, where economists do some kinds of mating and others. So I honestly, even though I'm an economist, I do know there are other special social scientists out there who know a lot, and I want to include those things. And so I've thought about signaling, i.e. how would emulations show off to each other? What would be the cheapest and most effective ways to show off, and when would they want to show off, and whether they would, even want to be around copies like themselves. So I think one of the most difficult things to imagine psychologically, because we just don't see it, is imagine there is another literal copy of you out there who acts and talks just like you. Do you want it around in your social world? I mean, it's all right if it exists out there and it has its own friends and things like that. You might wish it well and be glad for it and maybe even talk to it once in a while, but do you want it across the room from you sometimes? I mean, do you want another guy who talks and acts just like you in your social world that you interact with? It seems to me like you probably don't. So that means we're going to have groups of emulations, each of whom has one from each clan, and then you make a copy of that whole group. But within any one group, you only see yourself. That is, you don't see other copies of yourself in your ordinary work group or in your ordinary social group. That makes it a more familiar world, of course. Because even though you can be copied, you don't see those copies personally all the time. Now, you might see copies in the sense that at the beginning of a day, you can spin off copies of yourself who go do some tasks and then end. So if you need to stand in line at the DMV or some other task that doesn't need to be remembered, it just needs to be done, then you split off a copy who does it, it reports back when it's done, you say great, and that's it. But you don't have to deal with that socially. That you don't have to have your friends see you and it talking to each other and interact with the three-way sort of thing, which would get kind of weird. You can just, spin off a copy and have it do a task and be done with that.
While reading your book, I had to go online and start looking up philosophy and see were there any philosophers that in the past had talked about this type of stuff. I know there's a lot of theologian philosophers and about humans and who we are, the human mind, etc. And just reading a little bit about Kant or Bertrand Russell. And this has a lot of philosophical implications as well. Your book, you know, reading between the lines, a philosopher can pick up some of these aspects in there. And is this something that you would have kind of taught?
In a sense, it's the other way around, in the sense that for many decades, the idea of emulation has been a common sort of theme in futurism and science fiction and college bull sessions. It's a great idea to probe thought and to make people think, and people have loved to use it as that. But what they've usually done with this idea is they've either set a dramatic story there, or they've talked about the technology of how it could be made to work and when, or they've talked about the philosophy of it. And when they talked about the philosophy, they talked about the philosophy of, well, would it be conscious? Would an emulation really be conscious, or would it be me, right? Is an emulation of me, or is it somebody else? And people love to go down those paths and argue about those things. And in a sense, that's what they've done for decades. And they haven't actually asked the question, but what would the world actually be like if it happened? And so that seems to me the big thing that I've neglected. I didn't invent this topic at all. Again, for many, many decades, people have been talking about this over and over again in futurism, in science fiction, in philosophy. There's lots of philosophy journal articles devoted to philosophy of mind, discussion of emulations and whether they would be you or not in various ways. And it seemed to me like we were just going way overboard with all this philosophy and all this, technology aspect of it, and not just ask the very basic, but what would the world be like if it happened? And so that's the book I've written, is on the thing I thought was neglected. So I say very little about the philosophy of identity or consciousness. I say very little about consciousness or even the technology of how it would be achieved, or my estimates of the probability or when, because so many people have talked about that over the years. I've picked the thing I thought was neglected. What would happen if?
And it's an amazing topic, I have to say, Robin. And this book will be released in May.
June 1st is actually the current date. Okay.
June 1st. And I hope people check it out. And I'm sure if they go over to your website, overcomingbias.com, there'll be updates there, but also check it out on Barnes & Noble and Amazon, etc. If
you Google ageofm.com is also just the book site. So
yes.
HEOFEM.com.
Fantastic. And it's a fantastic site as well, giving us insights into what the book is about. And at the moment, there's a table of contents outlining all the topics of discussion. Good chunk of it is on economics, and you have the sociology things. And obviously, the book explains what brain emulations are, which I honestly hadn't a clue what it was until I looked into your work. And an amazing insight, I have to say, Robin. Absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
Robin, thank you so much for being so inspiring and for joining me on Economic Rockstar. I had a blast and I personally learned a lot from you. Share it again with our listeners where they can find you.
Overcomingbias.com and ageofm.com. I'm Robin Hanson, ROBINHANSON, so you can just Google my name.
Yeah, and you can find all the links to Robin on economicrockstar.com/Robin Hanson. Robin, you are an economic rockstar. Thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Thank you for having me.
And it's been a blast, I have to say. Honestly, I could talk for another hour or have a couple of episodes on this, because I have in front of me a page with a lot of questions that I didn't even
have me back in July.
Yeah.
Have me back in summer or something when the book is out.
To be honest, Manu's book hasn't been released yet, and I think it's coming out.
This is May, I think. And there's a third book. I don't know if you know, Cass Sunstein has a book about the world of Star Wars coming out about the same time.
Nice. And be nice to have
He's
Cass.
actually a more prominent author than either of us. He's a well-known author from other economics and law books.
Yeah. Well, we'll check that out, all right, with Cass. Most definitely. Thanks very much, Robin.
Take care.
All the best. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye. See you.